Abilities are cool, right? Well, let's take a look under the hood and see how such a system allowing you to destroy your enemies in wild ways and march into new frontiers actually works. Hey guys, and welcome back to a new devlog, one where there will be as little complaining about birds as possible. Today will be about my implementation of an ability system in its entirety, from how you select the abilities to how some of them are coded. Before we can talk about the abilities though, we first have to talk about... This is the new player selector screen. Looks pretty snazzy, but eerily familiar, right? Well, ignoring the button selector, we still have the same visualizer, vitalizer, and customizer as in the first version. So why would I make an entirely new player selector? Well, the old player selector screen worked fine. You could set your costume, see how it would look like, decide what abilities you need to take for the upcoming level, and once everyone decided what they would bring, the level would be revealed. The main problem with this was the level itself, as you had no idea how the level would look like, what kind of pathways and interactables existed, and how you could plan for them. This would either mean that you had to leave it up to chance, hoping you would get a level with the right interactable, or I needed to meaningfully incorporate every single interactable into every single level, in a way where each one can decide between podium and participation trophy, neither of which seemed like good options. Well, after some consideration, I chose the third option of adding in a small intro animation before you enter the player selector to give you a preview of the level, allowing you to plan ahead. Should be easy, right? If you watched any of my previous devlogs, you know the answer to this, and it's the same as the birds. So, after realizing I had to delete the old player selector screen entirely and start anew anyway, I decided I would use this opportunity to remake its UI as well, because I haven't really been happy with it anyway. The first step was deleting the entire thing, fixing all of the bugs that caused, and making a new intro animation. First, the camera moves up the level quickly to give you a tiny overview, and then the camera slowly wanders down the level again to give you a full overview, whilst not making it too straightforward to memorize. Finally, the camera zooms into the actual player selector screen and keeps moving up and down slowly as to replace a boring old background image. Once the camera zooms in, you go into the player selector screen, which shows you the new UI for your character and the characters of all of the other players. The main change to it, as stated previously, is the new key selector, which requires you to first select which key should be bound to which ability. If I now press the E button, the UI changes to the new vitalizer, and the key selector sends the key you selected so that the vitalizer can then bind the ability to the corresponding key. Now, if I were to click on the climber's hook ability, the visibility would change again, and the vitalizer now sends the selected ability back to the key selector, which adjusts the indicators accordingly. This is already quite a good system, but I'm not quite happy with it, mostly because of the 3 different keys you need to memorize. For example, in bobble battles, you also take up to 3 abilities bound to different keys into the fight, meaning that you have to keep track of both what abilities you chose and which keys trigger them. I have noticed a lot of losses due to misclicks or split-second delays because the players had to think of which key to press. This is not that bad in bobble battles, as the abilities still allow you to kill with a misclick, but it's only compounded in my game, as that is a race game with far more stricter and surrounding dependent abilities, meaning that one misclick could lead to a whole host of lost opportunities. I'm contemplating a change to a different system that only allows you to take one ability, which needs an input, and around 2 passive ones, meaning that you only need to keep track of one ability and its corresponding key. If I implement this, I will probably also change some abilities, so that each ability requiring a key press is a lot more impactful, because you would then only be able to choose one of them. But I'm not sure if that's the best option, as this limits my possibilities to create synergies and combinations with the abilities significantly. Back in the actual programming side of things, we now have a dictionary of selected abilities inside of the key selector, but this doesn't really do anything. So the root node of the entire player selector grabs the dictionary from the button selector and puts it into an array with other important data, like the player's current costume and the player's position. This array of all of the data is then taken by the multiplayer spawner of the various player selectors and added into a dictionary in global scripts, a script which can be reached from anywhere. As this can be reached from anywhere, it is then used by a variety of systems, such as the UI, which adjusts the new height indicators to the position of each of the players, and uses their costume to show the correct player icon. The UI also takes the ability dictionary from global scripts and uses this data to show the current abilities you have selected, as a small list here. The player itself also uses the player dictionary, every part of it actually. When the player is first spawned in, it looks up which animation presets its animated sprite 2D should use. It also constantly sets the position value in the player dictionary to its current position, as to keep the height indicators accurate, which in turn allows the players to make judgments and act on keeping their lead. And of course, the player also uses the player dictionary to know which abilities it should have. The upgrade node handles everything to do with abilities, even though it's called upgrades, which is kind of a misnomer. It firstly takes in all of the values of the player dictionary's ability dictionary and matches them to its own lookup table. After knowing where all of the abilities are, it adds them one by one and gives them some vital information, such as which node the root node of the player is, in which state the ability can be active in, and which key it should use. To make this process less error-prone, I have made a general ability class, which automatically holds all of these vital variables, without me having to declare them in every ability. All abilities inherit from this main ability class, which has some very important functions in it as well, which include the override function, to override the player controls, and the reset function, which gives the players the controls back, both of which are used in ramming and gliding. It also includes an add area 2D function with a parameter called collision mask. This function does literally what it says. It adds an area 2D with a set collision mask, which will scan for anything with the same collision layer activated. The ability class would probably be a lot fuller if I simplified the abilities down to stat buffs or the occasional random speed burst. But one problem I've always had with abilities in games is that most of the times a simple one just doesn't feel that good. A simple stat buff, even when it's noticeable, will probably never be as exciting as a new layer of depth to a game, which is added in the form of a custom handcrafted ability. This is why I really don't want to add simple stat buffs or other simple abilities to a Terran climb. I want to keep each ability unique with different use cases and synergies. We have now covered most of the system behind all of these abilities, but we haven't actually covered the abilities themselves, which are also a very important part of said ability system. Now, I want to cover 3 different abilities, which are the glide, the beans, and the sandwich ability, as those 3 represent 3 different types of abilities: movement abilities, passive abilities, and active abilities, as I would call them. The code for the gliding is probably the most complicated one of all the 3, as it first checks in the player's state machine if the player is in the ground state. If the player is in the ground state and was gliding previously, the player controls are reset. Else, if you're holding the spacebar and the player is currently in the air and the player is falling, the player controls are overridden and the player's gravity is interpolated to a speed of 500. The next line checks if you're actively gliding, because when the player controls are overridden, the player isn't in the falling state anymore. If you are currently gliding, it switches the player's sprite animation to the gliding animation, sets the gravity of the player to the adjusted gravity, and calls the function air movements and turn. And the last line is just checking to see if you stopped gliding in the air. The beans are a lot simpler. On spawning, it first sets its speed and the climbing speed variables to the normal speeds of the player. Then calls the add area 2D function with a collision mask value of 25, the value of the bean's collision layer. If something with a collision layer of 25 enters the area 2D, the area interact function is called, which destroys the beans and multiplies the player's speeds by 1.2, which gives a significant increase in speed. In the physics process function, it also constantly sets the position of the area 2D to the player's current position and checks if you've jumped, which will then remove your bean-related speed boost. And finally, the simplest ability of all, the sandwich ability. This thing literally just checks if a timer has run out since the last time you threw a sandwich, and then emits a signal in global scripts to spawn a sandwich projectile at the player's position and rotation. This signal is then picked up by the projectile spawner, which just spawns this projectile at the set position with the set rotation, and lets the projectile do the rest. The sandwich itself then randomizes its speeds, sets its direction, and travels in a straight line. It also constantly checks if anything it should collide with has entered its area 2D, and if it has, it tries to fling it and destroys itself. The sandwich also sets its animated sprite to the costume of the player who threw it now, meaning that each player has its own sandwich projectile. The second climber throws a bagel, because why not? The donut baker throws a donut, obviously, and Heinrich throws a sword, hilt first of course, as to not hurt the others. These custom projectile looks are only the start, however, as I'm thinking of adding different effects for each projectile. Where the sandwich and bagel are just normal, the donut is maybe eaten and halts the hit player for a few seconds, and the sword would do something. If I actually add this in, it would only feel natural to go a step further, giving each character a unique ability, like giving the climbers a climbing rope or allowing the donut baker to give the players donuts in passing, slowing them down. This could maybe even lead to some characters changing certain abilities entirely, like Heinrich punting the others off of the wall harder with the climber's hook, or beans buffing the climbers more, as canned beans are a staple for good proteins and nutrition. There is a problem with this I don't know how to solve, however, which requires a tiny bit of explanation. In games such as PlateUp, where there are a ton of customization options, there will be players who have found their favorite attire or switch it up depending on the context. There are colors, hats, and costumes allowing you to handcraft your favorite chef, ready to deal with any burning kitchen fire, overdone steak, or bad review trying to close the restaurant. Now imagine if each of these costumes had their own abilities, or at least stat buffs. If the top hat were to give you more money per person wearing it, why wouldn't everyone be wearing a top hat and a suit to maximize money gain? Even though maybe one player really loves the sushi outfit, the other likes the normal chef attire, and the third doesn't really care, as long as it's business casual. It sounds silly, but I want you to be able to pick the character you like best because you like the character design, not because you like the unique ability. Then again, this wouldn't just give every character their own feel, but also allow me to add more depth than before into each one, which could also be interesting. There have been, of course, tons of other smaller changes made, which couldn't really fit into this devlog, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. If you have any ideas for the problems I've noted in this devlog, feel free to write them in the comment section below. I hope to see you next time in the next devlog next month. Goodbye, and adiosa! No AI was used in the making of this video. Only me, myself, and I, with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, who have written the script, voiced the voice, made the art, programmed the programming, and gamed the game. And of course, made all of the errors along the way.